Welcome to this event. We are so happy to see so many of you here, more than we expected. And you are here for a conversation. So our goal is for you to hear from Derek. I'll move the conversation along, ask the questions we're interested in, but really, Derek's going to be here, tell you his story, tell you his perspective, tell you a little bit about where he came from and why it matters to where we are now. So Derek, just to begin, Dr. Dow gave a wonderful background, a bio, and I just want to hear a little bit from you. If you were to introduce yourself to someone for the very first time, and they were just to ask you, who is Derek Black and what's your story? What would you tell them?
Right. Also, make sure my microphone is working and everyone can hear it. Is that better? I'll speak loudly. Okay. And I also wanted to thank the community for having me here, Dr. Ray, Dr. Dowd, Critical Race Initiative, and Baha'i Center, and everyone who put the work into making this. It's a great turnout, a great community, and I'm really honored to be here. So, I grew up in this family. My family, both of my parents were actively involved from the time that they were in college. My dad had discovered white nationalism in the form that it existed in the 1960s through sending away for books. There were National Socialist groups. There were Ku Klux Klan groups that existed in the 1960s that were actively opposed to civil rights. And he grew up in northern Alabama, was a teenager, actually a young teenager in the 1960s, and really came of age in the 1970s. And his family were not involved in this sort of extreme activism. They were the more garden variety, racist views about how segregation is the way things are, and I'm not going to oppose integration, I'm not going to speak out, but isn't this a lot of troublemaking? Like, that was his parents, and that was my mother's parents too. It was this sort of view that things are changing, but it's not really affecting our lives. We'll just keep living in our town. We'll keep living in the South. We'll keep living in America, and you're overreacting. And my dad did not believe that. He looked at changes in American hierarchy, in the way the United States was changing around him, in integrated schools, in integrated politics, in more voting rights, as this existential threat to white people. And he did not see himself as a white supremacist. Like, he would tell people then and now that he is not a white supremacist because he didn't want a hierarchy. He wanted everyone in the world to be separated. And white nationalism is this belief system that race is a fundamental building block of humanity, that nothing defines humans more than racial groups, and that they're easily definable, which is not true, to be clear, that they are socially bound, that it predicts, that racial identity predicts everything from educational outcomes to criminality to culture to on and on and on down the line, that it's this fundamental part of being a person, and that everybody would be happier if there was worldwide segregation. And this is the worldview that white nationalism espouses, baked in, and it must be said, with this fundamental belief in an anti-Semitic global conspiracy, that it's Jewish people who are advocating for more open immigration policies into Western countries, more open civil rights laws, that it's not actually people of color who are behind pushing for rights, that it is Jewish people controlling it. And that's the worldview that this movement is based around, and it's the worldview that my family had spent decades building by the time that I was born in 1989. And so there was never a point where that wasn't central to the family. Like, when I was 4 years old, there were leaders of the white nationalist movement coming over to the house for Christmas parties to discuss conferences and to discuss meetings and events and to figure out how they could get political candidates elected, or how they could get more media appearances or representation, or more members, or more donations, building it as a social movement that had this goal of basically incrementally making people identify with more explicitly racist views.
Okay, so you grew up in this. You just, wow, that's really loud. You said 4 years old, people are coming over. So as you're growing up and defining who you are through being a teenager, through college, through that developing part of your life, you decide to go to university, and you decide to go to New College, Florida. When you made that decision, can you first talk us through a little bit about what that decision was and why you decided to go to New College? And then, did you ever think that going to New York College would turn out the way that it did?
So I applied to a liberal arts college, public liberal arts college in Florida, for kind of the normal reasons that anyone applies, that it was the honors college in the state system, Florida had very low in-state tuition, like all these kind of mundane reasons. And the background of this is that I did not think that there was any challenge to my family's ideology, that I had become very committed to it. It wasn't just that I grew up in it. I had founded an internet radio network to try to get white nationalist voices. I had founded an AM radio show to try to get people talking to the local community. I had run and successfully run for a Republican county seat in 2008 and gotten 60% of the vote in this local election, giving white nationalist talking points. And I really firmly believed that it was factual, that it had all this scientific backing, and that it was not, that it was even morally correct, that it was like what people believed. And it's because I had grown up viewing people who had seen it and who had built it, who had been advocates for it. And when I showed up at college, it was not new to me that people were opposed to racism and white supremacy. It was not the first time that I had heard that race is a social construct. It was not the first time that I had heard that this is a destructive ideology. But I had never heard it before what happened at college from anyone who I cared about. I grew up with death threats and hate mail and constant inundation of people writing in with either that opinion or like go to hell opinion. And they were just randos on the internet. So like, not telling the whole story of what happened in college, it was the experience of a community that didn't have to explain, oh, I feel threatened by what you're doing, but condemned everything that I advocated, that my family advocated, that I believed was true. And they were people who I had gotten to know, who were not some anonymous person who I could say, oh, they just don't understand. They knew me. I spent a semester on this college before I was actually outed, before people realized my background. And I knew them, and reading the student forum and having private conversations over years with individuals turned out to be much more impactful than I realized.
So those conversations that you had, I've read the book, I've read through some of the articles, and it seems, at least they're painted as conversations you were willing to have, but conversations that other people weren't necessarily willing to have with you. Can you talk a little bit about what it felt like when people wanted to sit down and didn't want to yell, but wanted to discuss your views and dissect them and find the scientific evidence?
I want to clarify how I view what happened at college. That there is a primary story that once I was there, I got to know people for a semester before I was outed and identified, and there was an enormous thread discussing at this small liberal arts college, what do we do about this? Because the values of the community were social justice, were racial equity, were trying to deal with systemic racism and like deal with it once they got out of college, and then finding out that the kid of a prominent white nationalist was in the school was a real moment where they had to decide what to do. And there's one way to look back on it and say one of the things that happened was a guy who I knew before I was even outed was observantly Jewish and hosted Shabbat dinners and reached out to me knowing that my family's ideology was deeply anti-Semitic, and said, do you want to come to dinner? And I went once, and that was not so surprising to me, because I wanted to be somebody who could interact with anyone, but I also continued going for 2 years, and through those dinners, I met people there who had these like private conversations where they would show me journal articles that said we're abusing statistics to talk about IQ and crime and all this. Like, it's not evidence. Like, when people say race is socially constructed, that's a real thing. You are pulling at science that doesn't statistically make sense. And dealing with those conversations feel very intellectual. And they were heated sometimes, but they were private and they were individual. They weren't performative. They weren't in front of people. And it's easy to look at that and say, okay, 2 years of these like intense conversations, breaking down the evidence bit by bit is what did it. And that's really how it felt at the time. But I look back on it now and I say, you have to look at the campus condemnation. That I had private conversations with people who were coming at me because I thought I was a person who had evidence. But the only reason I had those conversations was because this entire campus asserted itself and said our values are protecting threatened people. This ideology threatens people of color, threatens Jewish students, and the values of the campus are not to prioritize changing the mind of a white nationalist. The priorities of the campus are to say we are a space where people are welcome, we are a space where people can thrive, and we're not prioritizing racist views or trying to change them or champion them or do it. We are just going to dismiss and say we'd rather you leave, but while you're here, we're going to do things like have a school shutdown. We're going to convince the administration to cancel classes so that they could talk about how racism functioned even in this little social justice school that thought of itself as very, very non-racist, right? But it wasn't anti-racist. It was just people who wanted to be good, and so they were going to talk about that. They advocated for courses on anti-racism, like a requirement. They held organized meetings for people to champion themselves, talk about their experiences, like get the administration to respond to it. And that stuff was not always about me. It was about being the campus they wanted to be. And I was condemned in it. Like I was being told that people's lives were being made worse by what I was doing. People were being harmed by my words, by my actions. And I would not have gone to those conversations and said, here's my evidence for it, without that campus condemnation, without that like protest, without this like campus activism. And I think that's easy to get lost because it looks like nice conversations change your mind, and I think it's so much bigger than that. And it's not to say that protest and condemnation is unimportant or anything less than essential.
Okay, I'm gonna let that sit and we'll come back to it. So now that you've told us a lot about your story, where you came from, you have a perspective almost no one else has. You were a part of this movement. You were this movement in a way, and now you're not. So can you talk a little bit about where you think the leadership of the movement is now, both on the local, the national level? I know for those of you who have yet to read the book, which I highly recommend, you first came back into the light, into the world when Donald Trump got elected by writing an article about what he had to do with white nationalism, white supremacism. Right. Can you talk a little bit about the political leaders, the current white nationalist movement, and how you view it as someone who used to be a part of it?
Right. So my personal experience, I came to the end of that college experience and realized that I had to publicly condemn it, that I couldn't get to a point where I felt like I had no evidence and it was actively harmful and then just stop speaking. And so I wrote this public letter to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an anti-hate organization, and shocked my family and had to deal with the repercussions of that. But then I spent 3 years saying, I'm just not gonna speak anymore. Like I have condemned this and I've done enough harm speaking. I've done enough harm participating in things. I will just go quiet now and kind of naively believe that this movement will fade away because it's mostly old people. And that was always naive. And so watching the Trump campaign is the reason why I realized that I can't just not speak, that things don't change unless we all push back on them, and that's my role, that's my small role there, is to speak out against what white nationalist ideology explicitly looks like. The only people in the country who are proud about their racial views, like they don't cut and say, oh, actually, it's all about culture or something. They'll say, no, it's really about race, and they're the people who you can look to and see this sort of pure white supremacy. And so I felt like I had an obligation to explain that. And it is a movement that is relatively small. It's hard, it's not a membership thing, so you can't say exactly who's in it. I think there's a number that seems roughly correct, about 30,000 people who it's their life. They marry other people in white nationalism, they have children in white nationalism, their children's babysitter is a white nationalist, they live that life. They show up to meetings, they donate money, they volunteer their time, and that's still a relatively small number of people, but their goal is to produce material, to constantly refine their message, to figure out ways to reach people who are more subtly in agreement with what they're saying, to find ways to say, don't you think gun violence in cities is because of the people, and who do you think lives in those cities? Like, try to get this sort of outreach that takes people from a casually racist perspective that they will still defend themselves as saying, I'm not racist, but, and try to bring them to a place where they say, no, 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 it's all about race, and I'm proud of being white, and we need to push back on these social justice. They like to get somebody to that point was the goal of the movement, at least the political side of the movement, the people who wanted campaigns and elections, the people who wanted to be out having protest rallies, the people who wanted to have political power, which is the family goal that I was raised in. And they have not taken power. I don't want to be saying that, but their influence is really felt. Every time you see talking points used by more mainstream politicians that are the same things that only a white nationalist would have said in the 1980s. You can tell how the work of these 30,000 people to be clear in their racial worldview and to convince other people of it has held space, has created talking points, has allowed more mainstream people to adopt their message and to use it in the ways that it's actually effective. If you are trying to stoke fear or get a certain minority population of people in the country to respond to those messages, using the toolbox that white nationalism has created, can be effective. And I think that's what we see. It's not that white nationalists are out taking office, it's that their ideology has become more central and more to the center.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that it's not necessarily the white nationalists in power, but it's those using the messages of the white nationalists
Right.
to achieve power, to reach out to those people who haven't yet been spoken to by the politicians. Is that scarier for you than the straight up white nationalists, I know who I am, the subtle white nationalists? Or how does that work when you look at political leaders?
I think that it's extremely alarming because that's their theory of change is that lots of people, not necessarily a majority of white people, but lots of people subtly agree with their view that they want to live in whites-only neighborhoods, that they don't want inclusion, that they do not want multiracial workplaces, that they do not want to see people of color on TV, like that they believe that lots of white people in America have some version of that belief. And that if they can be the only one in the room who is going to push for it in a really explicit way, that they won't be completely outcast, that they'll have to deal with being condemned by mainstream sources, but that they will find some resonance somewhere. And the alarming thing is that they're not totally wrong in that. They can find resonance, obviously they can. And seeing it play out in like sometimes small elections, sometimes large elections, is extremely alarming. And like, how do you respond to it it's something that I don't necessarily have the answer to. I can tell you how they build their messages, how they reach out to people, how their ideology jumps into more mainstream spaces, because there's like a porous connection between someone who is an outright white nationalist and someone who shares some of the views and wants to help spread them. It's like it's a porous border and a network that is not the same but very closely connected. But how do you stop them is not, I don't have an answer to that. Like I can see messages that I helped promote continuing to spread now, and it doesn't matter if I say that's wrong. It doesn't stop it from moving. Okay.
Well, if you can't knock it down, I'm a little scared for the rest of us, but we'll try. So it's 2020. It's an election year. Everyone's still trying to figure out what's happening, both with Iowa and the country in general. For those of us who are sitting on one side of the political spectrum and a little nervous about how to talk to those on the other, you did this. You changed from one side to the other, not just political spectrum, but cultural spectrum. How would you advise for those of us who want to have those conversations to approach someone and then to finally sit down and talk about these hard subjects?
I do want to be clear that I I push back hard against the message that I think is sometimes taken from my example that we need to invite Nazis to dinner. And that, and eventually you'll get to all of them, and then it'll be fine. And that is not something that I believe. And it is persuasion. So the way I do view changing minds is that it is so much bigger than that phrase entails, that we talk about it like you might be reading a book one day and stumble upon a contradictory fact that really challenges some central worldview that you hold, and that any human being in the real universe would do that and say, oh, wow, now I believe something different, is not how persuasion ever works. People do not change their minds because they trip over a fact, and then they have to incorporate that. We are extremely resistant to contradictory facts. We clearly live in a time where what is a fact is in question for this reason, that ideology and identity is not malleable to just a contradictory fact. And so my view on what my experience was certainly that I encountered contradictory facts. I had these long conversations that took far longer than you should want, like years of factual conversations where I would read journal articles that were given to me by people who I had met at the Shabbat dinners, particularly one person. And I would deal with that contradictory information to what we said was evidence. And I wouldn't necessarily come at the end of it and say, okay, I don't believe that anymore. But then like 3 months later, we talk about it again, I'd say, yeah, that was bad information. And so that particular piece of fact I don't accept anymore. And cumulatively, there was no evidence for it because it's bad science. It's bad evidence to talk about race in some sort of definitive, ultimate way, the way that racists do. But that didn't happen in a vacuum. That happened because of community change. And so the way I view change your mind, I think the phrase change your mind is change who you identify as your community. And if we understand it that way, I think it's easier to understand how difficult it is to change someone's mind. You don't walk up to, you could walk up to anyone in the room and say, what is something that you hold really fundamental to your worldview? I'm going to convince you otherwise and see how that's going to play out. I'm not going to do it. However, you could imagine a scenario where you identify with people you have not identified with before, where people matter to you who did not matter before. And the universe of connections of people who you are responsible for or connected to in some way, that grows, then your views might change because you are challenged by people who, even if it's not something toxic that is directly threatening people, who it matters to them in a different way that you reevaluate what you believe. And if we look at it that way, you start recognizing how hard it is to change people's minds. It is a group thing, and it involves like asserting values. And so I get to the conclusion of this, and I say, I think most people, the easiest space you have to try to persuade someone else is not to invite a Nazi to dinner. It is to assert what your values are. Like, who do you prioritize? Who do you want to protect? Like, what institutions do you want to change? And that's the space that anybody can do anytime. You have different ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be like a protest march. It can be through your work. It can be through your studies. It can be through like whatever connection you have. But that's the thing that you do every day. And if you find yourself in a situation where your like dorm mate is the child of white nationalists and has a radio show, then you can say, what is my responsibility there? Are they willing to listen to me if I challenge their worldview and I feel safe doing so? Is that something that I should do or not do? But every single day you can assert values and know that that is having an impact on people, that condemnation is another form of connection. And it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you can't change someone's mind through asserting your community values, but I really do feel like you can, and that is not counterproductive in any way. Just that it takes all these things. It takes community condemnation, but it also takes some kind of outreach and for somebody to feel like they need to be persuaded and change, and that is a much bigger picture than the idea we have of like having a conversation and changing someone's mind.
Okay. Lots of steps. I hope you all listened. We're going to give you an opportunity to begin writing your questions down. If you have questions, you have note cards. If you raise them above your head, someone from the CRI team will collect them. Before we ask the questions, we're just going to have one final question from me, and then we're going to throw it out to all of you. And that's, we're hearing all these stories. We know who you used to be. We know who you are now. We know how you feel. Looking back on where you were, where you've come to, what do you want your legacy to be? What do you want, Googling Derek Black, what do you want to have come up?
Right. I mean, it's something that I am still working on myself. I spend my time doing research, working with people who are trying to build organizations. Like it's an important value of mine that something have more institutional structure than just be a one-off, that it needs to have a goal of what you're building to. So I try to work with organizations that have a theory of change, have an idea of what the world would look like if they were successful, and how do you impact people along the way. So I work with organizations like Facing History and Ourselves. One of the reasons that I felt very good about being here is that the Critical Race Initiative has this worldview about systemic institutional issues. It's not something about individual failings or your feelings. It is about policy changes are needed. Policy creates the world that we live in. So I try to contribute to that, education, policy changes, and doing research. My history research is not now, it is the 1600s and before, but I'm looking at what goes into creating the ideology of racism. There's a whole field that looks at this history of an idea and argues that it goes back many centuries, and how it's socially constructed, how the legal system creates oppressive hierarchies, and how those oppressive hierarchies get reinforced generation to generation. I think it's useful to show individual people doing that in the historical record, because it's more compelling than just saying it's a social construct. It is telling to look at somebody who's in the process of saying, what is it that defines people? And then the next generation saying, well, he said it was this, and so therefore I'm going to build upon it here. And then you end up with a legal system that reflects an ideology that's being built over time. And so that's a space that I am competent in. I can look at 16th century sources and try to reveal that, but that's very particular to me. And so in general, I'm just motivated day to day by thinking, who am I connected to? Who am I responsible for? And I think that's the universal, is like asking yourself, what people in the world do I think I have no connection to? What people in the world do I think are beyond the pale, and I have no reason, no way that I can think of that I have a connection to that person, and try to figure out how you do have a responsibility to that person, and then the work and what you do day to day sort of flows from that question.
So you kept saying sense of responsibility, right? Does that come from what you had done, from being a part of Stormfront, from running these conferences, from being a part of this family? Is this sense of responsibility kind of reconciling where you have been with where you are now? Where does that feeling of owing someone?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely upbringing. It's not, I have not, and I do not know if I ever will, reconcile that the ideology that I grew up believing, that I helped spread, is the direct cause of harm to people, of violence, that even though my family could say that they explicitly condemned violence and didn't allow it on their website, when people go out and commit violence in the name of their ideology, believing everything they do, and were motivated by the fact that they said who the enemies were, who the people who didn't belong were, it is not a sort of guilt that I can just alleviate. It's not, I can't say, well, okay, now I have done this many points of like opposition to that. It's sort of like an infinite thing, and trying to continue to push back is the only way that I see as a morally responsible way to act.
Okay. Do we have questions? Yeah. Great. All right, we'll start with these couple, and we'll see where we get. Perfect timing.
Before you get started, I just wanted, here are the questions, but I also want us to just quickly. Great, apologies. Also wanted to quickly thank Dean Nickerson, who is here in the audience today, who was very instrumental in getting as many people into this room as possible. So,
thank you. Appreciate it. All right, a question that I'm interested in that's in this pile. Did you feel you had permission from any family members to change, and what is your connection now with your family?
No, my family was very ideologically committed, and one of my regrets is that I wrote this public letter condemning it in a way that would be as public as possible, but I didn't warn them about it. I just didn't know how to talk about it. And so their reaction was to think that my email had been hacked, that I couldn't have written this letter, because the 3 years before that, I wasn't sharing it. I was just pulling back from their perspective, and they didn't realize the totality of the condemnation that I felt. And so it was really not clear whether we'd be able to keep talking. I argued that family is something different from ideology, and their response, at least at first, was, what about our family tells you that this family is bonded by ideology and politics and activism, and that's where our meaning comes from. I think it's somewhat remarkable that they decided that they wanted to be able to text sometime shortly after that. And on holidays, we can kind of message, like call on birthdays. We have some kind of connection. It's always tense and uncomfortable, but it's present. I think I'm glad for that.
Thank you. Lots of questions. This one I think is interesting. For a lot of us, when we hear about white nationalism or white supremacy, we picture KKK robes. We picture tweets that we see that come across our Twitter that we aren't necessarily in agreement with or straight up just disgusted by. This question asks, what movie or TV show accurately portrays the typical white nationalist, if any?
I think you might be surprised that BlacKkKlansman did it very, very well. They portray the different levels of people. It's like, I think like most movies, it's compressed, but there's all these different figures, types of figures who exist within the white nationalist movement. You have the people who are like actually David Duke, who was my godfather growing up and my sister's dad, and like really present, and who wears a suit and is like articulate and talks to the media and runs for office and does this sort of fancy sounding stuff. And then you have people further down or just different roles who are like regional, who are also wear nice clothes and carry themselves in a fairly sophisticated way and talk about how they condemn violence and that they just want the best for everyone. And then you also have people who are pretty open that they just don't like people of color, they don't like Jews, that they say the guys in suits who are advocating for that are trying to put on a good face, but really just don't want these people around. And like all those figures exist in this full spectrum of white nationalism, and that movie portrays one version of all of them, like in a room. People really do. I have been in rooms where people had champagne glasses and chanted America first. The things they say are really what white nationalists say. The way they talk to the media, it's all like, remarkably accurate.
Okay, if you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's a great movie. Watched it on an airplane, got a lot of weird looks, but I recommend watching it. This question asks, what I wonder from your perspective is first a stereotype and then a question to answer. So in your view, how do we bring more white men out of white supremacism or white nationalism? So first, is it all white men? Who is it making up this population? And then how do we talk to these people, not just in the way that we've already discussed, but how do we approach this situation where it's similar people in this movement?
Right. First, I would mention that it is not a total male movement. You have usually men are the spokespeople, but half, something like this, of this movement is made up of women, and they usually do things that are less public. Like they run the mailing lists, they organize the meetings, they make sure that the box lunches show up, they do things that are like coded feminine, but they are committed and they build the movement, and the thing couldn't run and exist without the work of women who are part of white nationalism, and it's really important to think about that if you're imagining what this movement looks like at its meetings and in its structure and its functioning. How do you get people out of it? I obviously am not a person who's going to say, well, no, nobody can change their minds. It's also not necessarily, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be possible to just like set up an organization and send out the right messages for the reasons I said earlier, that I think that's a misunderstanding of how persuasion works. But if people are open, if people are connecting to communities they didn't care about before, they didn't think they were responsible for, there's a moment where interventions are obviously possible. How to predict those moments, I don't actually know. Why somebody's life changes can be different. It can be because they got a diagnosis. It can be because they moved. It can be because something happened with a family member or a friend. Like, there are moments where people are more receptive and open to changing their minds about the world, and at any age, at any time, that is possible. But how to make it happen, I don't think that you can just create that situation. I think it's much easier, and lots more resources should be put into people who are sort of on the edge, people who are receptive, but who do not want to be a part of the marchers in Charlottesville. Like, they say, oh yeah, I think people of color commit more crimes, and that's just my belief. Those are the kind of people who I think you can intervene. You can say, this is racism, this is stereotyping, this is so much bigger than what you are giving it credit for. You need to challenge the worldview you have. And that kind of comes from personal connections. Like, it comes from people who know that person, who feel safe doing it, who feel like they can have that interaction. And it's a real conviction of mine that is the most powerful sort of interaction that happens, is not hearing something like that and then shrugging your shoulders if you know it's wrong. It's important to speak in that moment, to say, particularly for white people talking to other white people, to say that is wrong, it's factually wrong, it's morally wrong, and we need to challenge that belief. And it happens in any space. It's white nationalism. People who come into white nationalism are at every socioeconomic status. There are lawyers and bankers and people in high executive positions, just as there are people who are line cooks who come into white nationalism. It's not about education, it's not about income, it is about your beliefs and prejudices about other people that predicts whether you will be receptive to white nationalism. And anybody in any space, I guarantee you, has interacted with someone who believes this ideology in some way, whether they've gone on the websites or whether they are just receptive to it when it hits them. You interact with them, you see them. There's no way to know when you're talking to somebody except for those conversations. Like, having that interaction could have consequences years down the line that you have no idea. I just think it's incredibly powerful, and it's important, if you find yourself in that situation, to speak.
So bouncing off exactly what you were just saying, someone asked, what is your opinion on microaggressions, which I assume we mean comments of implicit bias, or at least what we would excuse as implicit bias. Do you ever agree that it's just a joke, or do you think there's always something more going on there?
No, I don't think it's ever a joke. I also don't think I'm necessarily the right person to answer the question. The question I usually ask if I'm going spaces is like, should I be the one talking there? And talking about the experience of someone who experienced oppression in society, it's not my space to say, oh, well, here's what that experience looks like. So I would ask people who feel comfortable to talk about their own experiences, and that's what I try to do, is work with people who like have the experiences. Ask people how I can be helpful and not speak for anyone.
Great. I think that's a pretty cool thing. I find this question really interesting. We talked a lot about Shabbat dinners. So I don't know, for those of you who have never been to a Shabbat dinner, arguing is a huge thing. We're Jewish. My dinner table at Shabbat is full of arguments over some trivial things, but some really important life issues. So this question asks, what role did or can religion play in your transformation? And did it play anything into white supremacy? Was religion a part of this movement?
Yeah, so the social movement of white nationalism, religion is central and it also actually not central. Like, what I mean by that is there are plenty of crazy factions of Christianity within white nationalism. There are people who are sort of British Israelites called Christian Identity, which believe that the Old Testament 12 tribes of Israel are actually Northwestern Europeans, and that people who call themselves Jews are actually pretenders, and so they keep kosher and they follow Old Testament law, and they have Bible study classes where they talk about how the Israelites in Egypt are actually Northwestern Europeans who later immigrated to England, and then that's where your ancestors came from. And that's kind of a lunatic thing, but it's a substantial part of white nationalism. There are people who create their own religions. There are religions of sort of agnosticism, that the universe is a machine. Like, religion plays this big role in this movement, but most people in it, my parents included, are just atheists. They just say, religion's not important, and then I would read into it now and say they replace it with racial identity. They would say whiteness is what's important, and so therefore there's no reason to think about God because you have your race to consume all of your time and your worldview and your ideology. And looking back on it, I think religious identity is the closest thing to white nationalist identity that I can pinpoint. That leaving that movement was, I can't think of another thing where if I said, I don't believe this, that the response from my family might be, well, you're not part of this family anymore, other than religious conviction. I don't want to stretch that metaphor too far, but I think that the way people identify with their ideology is so fundamental and core to how they view the world, how they view other people, and it leads to identity and belief being the same thing in a way that I think is somewhat similar to the way religious, at least religious extremism, but like sometimes religious identity can play.
So most religions have a holy book, right? A group of rules, laws. That's what they follow, that's what they believe. What's the white nationalist? I'm curious. It's not a question, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't think that they don't have one book. I don't want to carry it too far. They don't have like a doctrine, except for the ones that do. It's that I don't want to carry it too far. However, they do have core beliefs. Like they do have to say. I think you cannot be a white nationalist if you don't think that race is a fundamental part of humanity. If you disagree with that, you're kicked out. You can't be there. So there are huge fights. There are schisms about whether anti-Semitism should be fundamental to white nationalism or not. Because there are white nationalists who say lots of Jewish people seem white and identify as white and say they're white, and there are Jewish white supremacists in the world. Why in the world would you not allow them to be members and contribute? And those people have Jewish members. And the majority of white nationalism is deeply anti-Semitic and views the entire world as being run by a Jewish conspiracy that's anti-white. And so they have real conflicts, and they have a real doctrine about what it is that they believe, and they do not agree at all, and they kind of hate each other. And like it's interesting to look at, like from a just objective point of view, and it's horrifying to think about how they view other people.
Interesting. It's so interesting to me, and if you've read the book or if you decide you want to, that this Jewish question is such a question, especially like growing up as a Jewish teenager, I'm still Jewish, I'm just not a teenager anymore. Growing up knowing that there's always this question of the Jews. What did they do? You study Germany, you study modern. If I recall correctly, and I might not, was that one of the first times where you weren't sure about your beliefs? Was Matthew's conversation, and was it that question of what do we do about Jews?
Yeah. I don't know if that is larger than me or just me, that it was anti-Semitism that made no sense first. Early on in this college experience, talking to people and getting to know lots of Jewish friends who did not know my background, and realizing that this belief system condemns Jewish people in such a horrendous way that it is not possible for me to square my friendship with people and then them finding out my background and dealing with the repercussions of that. How deeply embedded Holocaust denial is, when Holocaust is an extremely well-documented event. This part of it was the part that felt insane earliest. And I don't know if it's me or I don't know if it's something about American culture, but like the racism part felt like, oh, that's normal. That's how America is structured. And the anti-Semitism part felt crazy earliest. And having to like deal with that and really see the connections between these things. That the same group of people who are rabidly anti-Semitic are the same group of people who are extremely racist and race essentialist and white supremacist. I think now I look back on it and I say, I think anti-Semitism and racism are different things, but the instinct and the othering, the sense of my enemy is very, very similar, and it comes from the same sort of identity-focused irrationality that, I mean, it's very rational actually, in the sense that your identity is you versus other people, and most people think about that in some way, but the consequences of it, the harms that it causes, the inhumanity that it creates are very, very similar.
Okay. We talked a lot about other people asking you questions, bringing you articles, arguing what your points were. Did you ever take it upon yourself to independently look into these things that you are now starting to question? Was there an independent change, or was it everyone else that pushed it?
There was independent research, but it was based and built on private interpersonal conversations. It was like, we're going to talk about how statistics in crime studies are being misused by white nationalists, and then I would read a few more things. It was the personal relationships that made me open to reading it, though.
Okay. So the conversations with others made you willing to then go look for yourself. When you were looking for yourself, did you look at something and automatically go to that white nationalist standpoint and argue why it was wrong before you would read into it?
Yeah, I was always looking for, here's what white nationalism believes, and here's what I want to dismiss about the argument, which I think that's a good way to put why facts don't change your mind. Like if I know, I go into any fact, anyone goes into any fact knowing what is going to challenge me and what I don't want to believe, and what is it that's going to make me willing to believe it. I look at it and I say it's personal relationships. You have a conviction that other people matter, and other people who you want to reconcile your beliefs with their beliefs, with the harm you cause to other people. That's, at least in my case, and I think probably more broadly, is one catalyst, if not the catalyst, that makes you willing to say, what if I was wrong about that? At least this one thing. And be willing to overcome the little voice in your head that says, that's not what we believe, that's not what we believe.
Okay. So those ideas that white supremacists hold dear, that they have the facts for, can you give an example of what one of those is and what the argument behind it is, and then you can dismantle it if you'd like?
Right. I think a really common one is IQ, that they put a lot of emphasis on generalized deviations between IQ scores around the world by populations from different countries. And so they look and they say, here's IQ tests given in 1972 in Nigeria. Here are IQ tests given in Sweden. Here are IQ tests given in whatever, like listen, they'll have these long lists of countries, and they just sort of flatten it, and they say, okay, here's the IQs of the world, and then and you can see where this is going. They say, well, okay, they incidentally do not say white people have the highest IQs. They say, oh, East Asian people have the highest IQs, and then Northwestern Europeans have the second highest IQs, and then they like rank humanity. And then they just go along their way and say, okay, that's how humanity works. And it is abused on every level. Number one, the IQ test is still heavily used in psychology. It's not a thing you should dismiss, but it's culturally normed. The IQ test is not something that you just take and give to humans and then they just like come out with an IQ. IQ test is culturally normed. If there are IQ tests that are normed to Aboriginal people of Australia, and if you took it, you would fail. It is a test that is based in norming to the expectations of the population you're giving it to. It has changed over time. So just straight off the bat, this list of like the IQs of the world is stupid. But then beyond that, IQ is also heavily influenced by prenatal nutrition, by education, by income, by ancestry, by population, by redlining, by like on and on and on. And so IQ is a thing that actually has influence, it like tells you something about assessments. It is not something that has anything to do with race. It's not something that has anything to do with even genetic populations necessarily. And the way white nationalists use it is this totalitizing view of humanity as being broken into blocks, and therefore people's performance is going to be predicted based on like some inherent thing about them. And it's not true in any way. It's easily at this point disproven, but if you want to believe it, you don't have to read literature. You just have to encounter some tenured professor who is willing to stand up in front of a podium and say, here's how IQ works. And if you want to believe you're part of a group that has some inherent IQ difference, then you can go on your way believing that. And how incentivized are you to challenge that belief? It's not, because it's not actually easy to do. Like describing all the things I just described, like if you want to spend time reading about that, it's not a 15-minute project. It's that if you want to understand how statistical analysis of intelligence works, that's not easy, but it's also, like, I don't know, worth it or not. It's disprovable.
So you have to be willing to say to yourself, I might be wrong.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, you have to be willing to say to yourself, I might be wrong, and you have to be willing to say, maybe my view is based in something other than fact, maybe it's based in what I want to believe, which is true of a lot of stuff.
Right. If you grow up in this establishment, if it's who you know, what you know,
Right.
You're not necessarily going to want to say, I'm going to argue with this. I don't want to be on the outside. It's more comfortable to be on the inside, whether or not I believe in it.
Yeah, and for me, I wanted to be somebody who believes stuff because of scientific fact. And so that actually turned out to be a weakness if my belief system was not backed up by anything, because it's just not scientifically provable and I just wanted it to be. I grew up hearing from tenured professors. We had professors from major universities showing up at white nationalist conferences and speaking to our banquets and telling us about how their evolutionary psychology research told them that behaviors by race were just totally real and true. And then everybody would say, oh, well, you know, a tenured professor said it. And maybe they'd read their work, maybe they wouldn't. They definitely wouldn't read the 1,000 rebuttals from other people in their field. And they definitely would hear that that person's department was trying to fire them for their bad science and say, look, they're trying to suppress the truth. And then you see how like ideology works.
So this change that you went through, we talked a lot about it. Everyone knows the story. They can learn more. Do you know anyone else? Don't out anyone who doesn't want the world to know. But do you know anyone else who's had an experience like this, who now looks back on where they came from, kind of like you do?
I think it's not incredibly uncommon for people to leave white nationalism. But generally when they do, it is quiet. And I think also, maybe this is overgeneralizing, but I think it's also true that they do not do it because they are deeply affected by harm to other people and want to try to undo harm. It is because that it's a kind of a toxic environment and they don't want their family to be a part of it. And so they say, they become the more casual version. Like, I wish that American demographics weren't changing, and I wish that I didn't have to interact with people of other racial groups at work, but it's not worth it. And then they live their life that way. Like, that's not very uncommon, actually. There are cases of people who left it and condemn it, but there's not that many. And there's not a community of people who you go hang out with. It was one of the hardest parts for me when I condemned this worldview and lost everybody who I had known up until I was 19 years old and the connection to my family. There wasn't a community that I then start with. It was just a long time of maybe there is no connection for me.
So there's no support group?
I mean, there are organizations that try to reach out to former skinheads, and there are things that sort of exist, but it's not this big network. And I connect that to there's not that actually many people. We're not talking about millions of people. We're talking about a fairly small social movement. And most of the resources get put into just observing their propaganda, trying to monitor their organizing, trying to prevent trying to prevent violence, trying to prevent any sort of illegal activity. And that's where most of the resources end up going.
Interesting. So I have one final question. Thank you, everyone, for adding your questions to this conversation. When people leave here and they go back home and they get asked what they did today, and they say, well, I went to this conversation with Derek Black. He's the former godson of David Duke. This is his background. He used to be white nationalist. What's the one message you want them to share with the people who ask them about what they did today?
Can I have two?
You can have two. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
One, that it is a mistake to say this social movement of white nationalism is what racism is. It is, the white nationalists are aware that they are appealing to a larger institutional thing. They are appealing to history. They are appealing to people's more subconscious or at least less explicit beliefs. They are appealing to something that is much bigger than trying to build just their social movement. They view racism and white identity as something that is so much bigger than them that they just need to kindle a flame. And that's really how I think we should all see it. Racism is something that functions in all of our lives, like individual interactions up to the social structures that we have all created. And like that's the view, that's how white nationalists see it, that's how I think it really is. And so combating it is not about changing an individual's mind and you fix the problem, it is about fixing the society you live in and righting inequalities that do not right themselves without intervention. And the other is, I guess, sort of the opposite of that, that if you have individual change in mind, facts will not do it. You cannot give them a book and change their mind. You must have them connected to you through some kind of community, through some kind of larger social structure that is around, that makes the two of you relevant, and they have to be willing to listen. And all of that has to be true before you can move on. You cannot put pamphlets under people's windshield wipers and change their world.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek, for coming to talk to all of us.